let's go over the skeletal segments of movement that are needed for you to target the quadricep, the hip flexors in the saddle pose family archetype. So the first movement you might be a little bit intrigued by because we often don't see it right away in the saddle pose, but it's an extension of the femur because precisely the target area, that front sheath, requires an extension. Of course, from there, obviously our pose starts in a seated, our knees are bent. Depending on what's happening here as well in the base, it will also require an internal rotation of the femur. Some body types like that variation. What will add then even more of an extension is as you lay back for the pose. So then from there, we're adding extension of the lumbar vertebrae as well, the spine. And depending if we're on our hips, on our heels, and our hips are lifted off the ground, then there's more of that element of extension, and you'll have a little bit more intensity maybe in the hip flexors. So let's go ahead and explore in this next lesson some of these variations and flavors to the saddle pose. I am dividing the segments of movement, preparing us towards the pose, and in and of themselves, depending on the person, some of these are also variations of the pose. So we could work with them in our bodies if we notice that we have a hard time coming into the pose, and if we're teachers, with our students. A block is what you might need in this class, 2 blocks as well, depends on your body. You're going to need it in our Sphinx pose. So we're going to start seated on our heels. Seiza. Seiza is the beginning point to saddle. Depending on the variation you're going to do, this is where you sit. If you like, you can lift your hips, place a block. You might not need a block underneath your hips, and go ahead and take a little step out with your feet. Internal rotation of the femurs start to happen as soon as we're doing that. Your knees do not have to be locked together unless they feel very comfortable like that. If that is what happens naturally, we allow it. But if not, we can allow the knees to abduct. They can be as far apart as they need to be. That's comfortable for you. And we'll hold here for about 1 more minute. If your knees hurt, if you can't sit back on your heels, use as many blocks as you need. For some people, for various different reasons, they cannot bend their knees this way. You can go into child's pose laying on your back, and that's a perfect variation, just laying on your back, knees towards your chest. It won't target the internal rotation with our feet that we have right now in this form of antler pose. But again, we're just understanding segments of movement, and from there, bringing them in different ways into our bodies and our different bodies, specifically your body. Coming out of the pose, lift your hips off the block or off the ground. Allow yourself to come onto your belly. So the pose can start here for a moment in Sphinx. If you feel like you need to take a short rebound, you can do that. But take note that we don't always have to rebound in between poses. The rebound can have a specific moment after a set of poses as well that we choose to do that. So we can be on our elbows, on our forearms. This is Sphinx pose. If you like a little bit further up, maybe you can't go fully up into seal because seal is also another choice, then you can use the blocks to place your elbows on. You're perfectly fine elevating the scapula, so that's your shoulders lift up. Or a lot of people define as sinking in the pose. It's actually not sinking. You're lifting, you're elevating the scapulas. It's a movement that your scapulas can do. If anybody likes seal, any version of seal, of course, then in that case, you are fully pushing into your hands and lifting your spine a little bit further up. Your head allows you to go deeper in the pose if you're bringing the head up and back. Or you can add a cervical flexion by allowing your head to fold forward. Your feet and your legs are also free. They're free. They can come as far apart as they need to be. Maybe perhaps you have kind of a duck walk such as I do. It's very comfortable for me to actually point my toes out in these type of poses. But again, that is what my body likes to do, what's comfortable for my body. My knees don't hurt when I do this. You will very well know if you try this, it's not the right fit for you. And you will very well know if you try this if it's the right fit for you. We shouldn't struggle too much with what we think we should be doing. You just try a variation. If it doesn't work, you go back to another variation. If it doesn't work, you explore a little bit more. If it doesn't work, you can write to me and I'll help you find your pose. So don't be fooled by watching my pose. Some spines do not have the movement for it. There's not a lot of space between each spinous process, and that reaches compression very quickly. That's where for some bodies, Sphinx is the ultimate pose. I invite you to come out of the pose, rest on your belly, bring your forehead either over your hands that have been placed as a pillow or the side of your face on your hands. So note that Seiza or antler, depending on what variation you did there, and then Sphinx or seal, work as poses that target similar areas in regards of segments of movement. But what these poses sometimes miss is actually targeting the muscle sheath in and of itself. So that would be the quadricep and the hip flexors. We can choose to do other things such as dragon as a pose to allow us to go a little bit further into this. And let's explore that so we can find the target area there. Come back onto your hands and knees. If you like, take a moment, just a little moment in child's pose. If you're one of those people that really likes to do counter poses, or if your lower back is quite sensitive. And back onto your hands and knees, preparing towards dragon. Step forward with the right leg and keep that left leg back. So here in dragon pose, notice that depending on what your body needs, you might have to step that right foot a little bit further out. The toes might have to point out. You really want to feel like the stretch is in that left quadriceps, so the top's front of the foot a little bit further up towards the top of the hip flexors. And some people kind of just find it very quickly. Other people, I have quite a hard time finding that stretch. So I'll either sometimes go on blocks and come a little bit further up. I add a bigger extension of the spine, and that allows me to find that stretch a little bit more. Sometimes I go all the way up into a tall, what I call a tall dragon. So I'm just straight up. I allow my foot to come in a little bit more into a short step, and this gives me a form of support. And other times I just like to go ahead and grab that back foot. But this is available for me at pretty much no cost, in the sense of I don't have to struggle to grab the foot. This isn't an objective. This is a variation. This is an option. You have to stop thinking that the more complex a pose is, the better it is. You can receive a lot from a very simple pose. And I often like to remind myself and others that the poses that will really be with you throughout your life are the simple poses, not the complicated ones. The ones that will stick with you when you're sick or pregnant or recovering from something are the simple ones. Coming out of the pose, bringing that right leg back. Take a rebound however you like. I'm just going to rebound sitting on my heels. You can rebound on your belly. You can even rebound on your back. Don't worry, you'll make it back up to the other side. Prepare the other side. Coming onto your hands and knees. Step forward with the left foot, keeping that right leg back. For some people, sometimes it requires taking actually a little step further back with that right leg. And as I mentioned before, that front leg doesn't have to be knee in line with the heel, because it really depends on your ankles, how easy it is for you to take that heel a little bit further back and do kind of what we call a short step dragon, which for me is my favorite choice of this pose and this base. But again, this is your practice. Try and see what feels better for you. You should be feeling that you're stretching the quadricep and the hip flexors. A reason why I really wanted to include dragon in this pose is because oftentimes for a lot of people it's a really good pose as a variation for saddle, as an easy to teach, easy to access. You don't need a lot of props. If you wanted to, as I mentioned before, you can explore using blocks to either lift your spine a little bit further up. There are lots of versions of bringing the elbows and forearms onto the ground, and that's perfectly fine. You can even from there also go ahead and grab the foot if that's easy for you. But note that sometimes that will really lessen the intensity of the stretch. Sometimes I'm saying because maybe not for your body. Maybe it's just mine. That when as soon as I start to lower my torso, I lose that target area. I'm just holding for a few more moments. And gently coming out of the pose. Lift your hips, bring that leg back. Rebound either on your belly or on your back. And preparing, coming back up towards the seated pose. Preparing for the saddle archetype. And I'm actually starting in a seated pose because I'm going to first recommend half saddle. And then from half saddle, I'll show variations of saddle and you'll choose. So obviously one is an asymmetrical pose. One side of the body is doing something, the other side of the body is doing something else. The other one is symmetrical. They're both doing the same thing. Symmetrical poses are a lot harder on the spine. Harder, not in a bad way, just more intense for your spine. So choose as well from what you regularly do. I always recommend that if we're practicing online, those are more, for me personally, not the time to try new things. It's times to kind of explore, definitely explore, but anything that you don't usually do in your practice, that you usually say, no, not right now, unless you're really feeling like you've warmed up the areas and you want to give a gentle approach to it, then go ahead. But please be careful with saddle pose. Saddle pose is, I would say, one of the hardest archetypes that we have. Most difficult. Now I do mean most difficult. So if you're seated with your legs straight in front of you, half saddle, very clear to see the internal rotation. So we're going to bring the right leg back. The heel comes back. So I turn, the femur's turning in, foot's coming back. However you want to place this foot depends on your body type, the tibial rotation that it has. I personally do it like this with the outside of my foot. I'm not saying this is the new way to do it, the big trend, the best way. You can very well choose to place the top of your foot on the ground. The hip does not have to touch the ground. What you do want is to start to lean back, and maybe just lean back enough, placing your left hand on the ground. That's enough for you. That's perfectly fine. You might already be feeling a stretch here, and if you're feeling a stretch here, that's a-okay. Don't force that right hip onto the ground. I actually invite you that if it's coming off the ground and it's too intense, lift it off the ground a little bit more. So that's going to help you find less intensity. If you're going to go into the other version, you're laying on your back, but as well, that pose is just if this is something that you regularly do. Different forms of saddle. If you're doing this half saddle and that's the pose you're going to do, please straighten your leg. We'll do it together at the same time when I mark the beginning of the pose. So for saddle, different versions seated on your heels, one form of saddle. As I mentioned before, this is going to work more with the back bending element. So you're really arching your spine as you bring your shoulders back to whatever degree with a bolster. So you can be somewhat here with your elbows. This can be different ways that you work with. If you have internal rotation, you can go ahead and bring those heels out, sit between your heels, and then from there, make your way back. Notice my knees really separate for my body to find comfort. I don't fight this. I'm not forcing my knees to come together. Once you're on your back, if you're comfortable, you can bring your arms over your head if that feels like the appropriate choice for you. But again, so many ranges of motion. Lots of people have to be very gentle with this pose, especially because, again, very often we take it as a knee pose. It's not at all a knee opener. We're only going to hold the pose for 3 minutes. So go preparing whichever pose you're going to do. And if you're doing the half, so if you're doing one side, I'll let you know at the halfway mark to change and do the other side. If you're doing any form of saddle, go ahead and prepare the base that you need and find your way in towards your pose of choice. And we're so used to going to yoga classes and seeing everybody doing the same pose, and it's as if everyone aspired to do the same pose, and on top of it in the exact same way with this perfectly envisioned aesthetic. And this is not the reality of how our bodies work. Our bodies are asymmetrical. Our bones are shaped different. So from your core, already something is making your body look different. The proportions make our poses look different. And then, of course, the tissues around the joints. When there is tension, that's when we feel stretch. And I'm using that word tension as there's resistance from those yin tissues. So from there, I can start to understand that depending on what I've been doing or where I come from as well, I might need a different variation on any given day. We do not all need to be doing the exact same pose in the exact same way. We just want to be able to start finding the sensation in the appropriate place. So if you're doing half a pose, come out of the pose. So if you brought that right leg back in half saddle, lean onto your left side, straighten the right leg. There's no rush. Take a little moment in between sides. Massage the knee if you need to. Your knee should not hurt. Sometimes it can feel a little bit vulnerable, but there should not be pain in the knee. And go ahead and prepare the other side. And just really inviting you to take the gentle approach. It really is more sustainable in the long run. And for those of us that are in saddle, needless to say, you're still in your saddle pose. Just a few more moments in this pose. You can always come out of the pose whenever you need to. Let's gently make our way out. If you're in saddle, whatever variation, you might just straighten your legs out. Some people have that mobility. For other people, you have to push into your elbows, lift your spine, sit back onto your heels, and then whatever variation you like to rebound. Child's pose if your lower back needs that. And those in half saddle, you might just lay on your back. Taking whatever form you need for Shavasana, for the final and longer rebound. And I gave an option in the first class to either complete the class seated or laying on your back, and that's an option that's always available. I do suggest taking the time to acknowledge what your body has been doing in the class. And because I don't work with counter poses, you're also free to place a counter pose or do any form of yogi's choice that you need after our time together is done. Thank you so much. Namaste.